I'm Larry Temple. As chairman of the Lyndon Baines Johnson Foundation, it is my real privilege to welcome all of you to the Tom Johnson Lecture with Supreme Court Justice Neil Gorsuch. Now, some of you may ask, who is Tom Johnson? And why is a lecture named for him? Well, I'm going to tell you. Tom Johnson has been one of the most renowned and celebrated journalists and news media executives in this country for the last 50 years. Tom was chosen for the inaugural class of the White House Fellows in 1965 and caught the eye of President Johnson. He stayed on in the White House and ultimately became Deputy Press Secretary and Special Assistant to the President. When President Johnson came home in 1969, he enlisted Tom to come with him to serve as Chief of Staff to the former President, and later as Executive Vice President to the Johnson family television and radio stations. After President Johnson's death, Tom served as publisher and CEO of the Dallas Times-Herald. From there, he went on to the Los Angeles Times and became publisher and CEO. Ted Turner stole Tom away to become president of CNN, where he served until his retirement. Tom has received every significant award and recognition his profession can bestow upon him, including Publisher of the Year when he was at the Los Angeles Times and Cable News Executive of the Year while at CNN. Tom Johnson has been a member of the LBJ Foundation for 50 years. The Tom Johnson Lectureship was established by the foundation to honor Tom when he stepped down after 30 years as our chairman. Tom Johnson's most enduring legacy will be the cause that he has championed since he retired from CNN. Tom has courageously and openly acknowledged his lifetime battle with depression and has devoted much of his life to helping others battle that insidious disease. Nobody, and I truly mean nobody, has done more than Tom has done to tell those afflicted that there is no reason to be embarrassed and hide from depression, and that modern medicine can now contain it and may someday be able to totally cure depression. Tom Johnson is a true hero in that fight. The highest accolade that LBJ could ever pay to anyone was to refer to him as a can-do person. Tom Johnson is the ultimate can-do and has done it man. So before I introduce the program tonight, I want to ask Tom, who is here, to stand, and let's recognize and salute him. Tom? Now to tonight's program. Many of you may know that in the life of our country, we've had 45 presidents. What you may not know is in those 230 years, only 114 men and women have served on the United States Supreme Court. So it is a particular honor and compliment to us to have Justice Neil Gorsuch here tonight. I want to make a comment about the court. When we see newspaper or television or radio reporting about a Supreme Court decision by a divided court, maybe a 5-4 decision, for example, the news media report frequently states how the Republican appointed judges voted, or how the Democratic appointed judges voted, or how the Trump, Obama, Bush, or Clinton appointed judges voted. I think that's unfortunate. Chief Justice John Roberts correctly has publicly stated that the court does not have Republican judges. The court does not have Democratic judges. The court does not have Obama judges. The court does not have Trump justices. While its decisions frequently have political import, the court is structured in the Constitution to be impartial and judicial and not politically partisan. As one who has great respect for the court, I believe the 9 members of the Supreme Court are and should be simply justices, without prefix and without suffix. So I am proud to have the opportunity to introduce Justice Gorsuch tonight without any explanation or adjective to adorn his title or position. Very few of the other 113 individuals who have served on the Supreme Court came to the court with the qualifications, experience, and proven talent of Neil Gorsuch. He has the academic underpinning with a bachelor's degree from Columbia University, a law degree from Harvard, and a doctor of philosophy in law from the University of Oxford. He got his first exposure to the Supreme Court when he served as a law clerk to both Supreme Court Justices Byron White and Anthony Kennedy. Neil Gorsuch was a prominent and successful lawyer in private practice for 10 years. He experienced the government side of legal issues as Principal Deputy Associate Attorney General in the Department of Justice in President George H.W. Bush's administration. Thereafter, Justice Gorsuch served on the United States Court of Appeals for the 10th Circuit for more than 10 years, where he was widely admired and respected by the legal community. Academic scholar, successful lawyer representing clients in private practice, government lawyer, distinguished judicial experience. That is why I can say few of his peers came to the Supreme Court as qualified as Justice Gorsuch. There is one other spotlighted facet of this man. Justice Gorsuch is the intellectual leader and the most prominent advocate of originalism in interpreting the United States Constitution and textualism in statutory interpretation. Now, some of you may say, what does that mean? Well, I would not presume to try to define or explain those terms when the preeminent expert on those concepts is here tonight. I am sure Justice Gorsuch will tell all of us what he has in mind and what they mean. Now, moderating the conversation with Justice Gorsuch tonight will be presidential historian and president of the LBJ Foundation, Mark Updegrove, who needs no further introduction to those of you who have been here before. So please welcome to this stage tonight, United States Supreme Court Justice Neil Gorsuch and Mark Updegrove.
Justice Gorsuch, welcome.
It is such a delight to be here, and I have to tell you, I just had one of my bucket list lifetime treats. Tom Johnson and Larry Temple just gave me a personal tour of the library and museum. Thank you, gentlemen. I will remember that for the rest of my life. More importantly, thank you for your lifetime service to this nation.
Hear, hear. Justice, first of all, thank you for being with us this evening. Congratulations belatedly on your appointment to the Supreme Court, and congratulations on a republic if you can keep it. I hope you got your copies outside. It's a wonderful read, and we're going to talk about this book tonight. And I want to start with, before we jump into the book, you have been a Supreme Court Justice for about a year and a half now.
2.5.
2.5, excuse me. 2.5 years. Pardon. 2.5. How has your life changed since President Trump nominated you for the court in February of 2017?
How hasn't it changed? I was living a pretty quiet life just outside of Boulder, Colorado, on a little farm. And I'm not living there anymore. And I was a circuit judge for the 10th Circuit, 20% of the continental United States. It's a wonderful court, great people, from Oklahoma to Utah, Wyoming, down to New Mexico. I think maybe just, here's how my life changed. Here's when I knew it was going to be a little different. So, as you may recall, President Trump wanted the announcement to be a surprise. And he sent 2 young lawyers out to collect me, to bring me back to the White House for the announcement. And so far, things were pretty normal, actually, as far as those things go. They called and said they were going to arrive on Sunday night. I was out mowing the lawn. Louise has a curry dinner on Sunday night, so I invited him for supper. So far, that's Sunday night. We usually have some guests over. That's a thing. Well, the next morning, the President of the United States tweeted. He said, flash announcement, I'm going to declare my Supreme Court choice tomorrow night at 8. Well, in about 15 minutes, it seemed like every media outlet in the 10th Circuit had descended upon the end of my street. And I think the end of everybody's street who was under consideration at the time. And there's only one little road in. The picture on the book is kind of near my old neighborhood. There's only one road in and out. And so the young men were going to come collect me, but now they felt like they had a problem. Because if they drove in, they'd be spotted. And they didn't want that. They were in their suits. So their first trick was, they said, we'll come a little bit late. We're going to go to Walmart. And we're going to get some clothes more appropriate to the Colorado countryside. And they did. They still have those clothes. And then they called and said, you know, we've done that, but we realize our car's a rental car with out-of-state license plates. And if we drive in, they're going to know, and the gig is up. So we have a better idea, Judge. Would you mind, you and your wife, hiking? About a mile through the prairie. And we'll meet you at the trailhead. Now, I love these young men. They're great young public servants, but I was not going to drag my wife's roller bag for a mile through the prairie. And I said, I want to help you out, but I can't do that. But I have an idea. This is what we're going to do. My next door neighbor, he's an old dear friend, and he'll drive us out. And the reporters have seen his car come and go, and so they may not notice. And if they do, I'm sorry. Tough luck. And they begrudgingly said, okay. I went over to my neighbor, and he said, sure, I'll take you out. And then he said, I have an even better idea yet. He said, there's another way. And I had lived in that house for a long time, and there's only one road. And he said, yeah, but the horse trail. I've driven it, and I can get you out another way. And I said, you can't drive that trail. He said, Neil, I grew up in Iran during the revolution, and I would never buy a house with only one way out. You know, and everything did change. You know, I was very anonymous, and immediately I was not. You know life has changed when people start videoing you at a restaurant slurping your noodles from across the room, right? And for a while, I confess, I mourned my anonymity a little bit. And then I realized, you know, and we all know this, that when God takes something away, he usually gives you something in return if you look for it. And what he gave me, and is the greatest gift that I love to this day, is the opportunity to see how much the American people love their country, how much they love their Constitution. Not a day goes by without somebody coming up to me and saying, I'm praying for you. I'm praying for the country. I wish you well. I voted for this president. I didn't vote for this president. I wish you nothing but the best. The kindness and the goodness of the American people are incredible. I get letters, I get prayer cards, I get gifts. My favorite gift was shortly after the confirmation process. A woman in Florida wrote me and said that my socks were falling down. So she sent me a bag of socks. And during the process, my favorite moment that really drove it home for me was I'm on a plane going back and forth between DC and Denver, meeting with all those senators. I met with 81 senators. Any senator who wanted to meet with me, I said I'd meet with them. And I did, for as long as they wanted to meet with me. And I'm pretty tired, going back and forth. And I get seated next to a 6-year-old girl. And about 15 minutes into the flight, we start hitting some serious turbulence. And she leans over to me and she says, "Would you mind if we held hands?" So we held hands for about 20 minutes till the turbulence passed. And then she leaned over and she said, "Do you want to draw?" We spent the next 2 hours coloring in her coloring book. And I was anonymous again for just a minute with a young girl that reminded me of my girls at that age. And at the end of the flight, her mom, who did recognize me, was seated behind us. And about 2 weeks later, I got a thank you note. And it was 2 stick figures in front of an airplane holding hands. I keep that in my office. Yeah, the American people are very good.
It's worth noting that that private road that your neighbor took you out on, you note in your book, was bumpy, portending the figurative road ahead for you. And we'll talk about the confirmation process that you had to go through in one moment. But before we get to that, I want to say, while you're relatively new to the Supreme Court, you were a clerk to 2 of your Supreme Court predecessors, Byron White, who was appointed by a Democrat, John F. Kennedy, in 1962, and Anthony Kennedy, appointed by Republican Ronald Reagan in 1988. What did you learn from those 2 Supreme Court justices?
Well, Anthony Kennedy is about the kindest man you'll meet. He is a civil and gentle man. Agree or disagree with him, he is a model of civility. And he taught me at a young age that you can handle very difficult and important issues. You can discuss them, you can hold convictions on them, and you can be kind. That's Anthony Kennedy for me in a nutshell. There's an essay about him, a tribute I wrote on his retirement in the book. Byron White, he taught me a lot of things. And I hope we talk about him a little bit later, more. But he taught me never to be afraid. He was a fearless man. And he never cared if he was remembered or got credit. And I've got a story about that.
Please.
You want me to tell that now?
Please do.
All right. So here's Byron White for me. We're walking along the corridor in the Supreme Court of the United States, and I'm his law clerk. And where all the portraits of all the former justices hang. And he says to me, "Neil, how many of these guys can you actually name?" And I thought about it, and I answered him honestly, about half. And then he said something that shocked me. He said, "Me too." And then he said something that really kind of depressed me at the time. He said, "And that's exactly how it should be. And I will be forgotten too soon enough." And I thought, that is heartbreakingly sad. And B, that's not possibly true. Byron White was my childhood hero. He still is. His bust sits in my office. Now, for those of you who don't remember Byron White, and no reason you should, he was the first justice from Colorado and always will be. He led the NCAA in rushing, took the CU Buffaloes, and yes, they have an actual live buffalo as their mascot, to the Cotton Bowl, all while graduating first in his class. First in his class from Yale Law School, Rhodes Scholar, led the NFL in rushing, and was highest paid football player of his day. World War II hero, Bronze Star winner, friend of Jack Kennedy's. Helped Bobby desegregate the South. Served on the United States Supreme Court for 31 years. Nobody, I thought, would ever forget Byron White. How could they? My hero. And you know what? I walk past that portrait every day now. And there are tourists there who have no idea what they're looking at. And I realized that White was telling me something not at all sad, but quite happy. And he lived this, that the true joy in life isn't the NFL rushing or the highest paid this or that. It's finding something greater than yourself and devoting yourself to it. He loved this country. He loved our Constitution. People beat on him from one side and from the other constantly during his tenure on the Supreme Court of the United States. He did what he thought was right every single day. It was his job. And then he went home without any airs, without any pretenses. He was one of the humblest men you'll ever meet. One of the smartest, toughest, humblest men you'll ever meet. And he knew that none of it much matters, and that what's really important is this country. That's what he taught me.
Did those experiences prepare you for being a Supreme Court Associate Justice, or can anything prepare you for that?
I mean, I've been blessed. Young people, and I know there's some students here, one thing I've learned is be careful who you hire as your mentor. Be careful who you hire as your mentor. And I know you don't believe me because you're saying, I have all this debt and whoever hires me, I go to the highest bidder fast as I can, right? Yeah? I see some nodding heads. I get it, okay? But I used to teach ethics and professionalism at the University of Colorado for years. And the one thing I learned in that process is I could lecture at you all I wanted. We could talk as long as I wanted. And the truth is, you're going to learn your professional sense of ethics from your first couple of bosses. We imprint like ducks professionally. So be careful who you choose to imprint upon. All right? And I was very blessed in that regard. I got lucky. But was I ready? I mean, is anybody ready? I mean, gosh, no. I mean, it's a humbling privilege every day to walk in that building. Yeah.
One of my mentors, Larry Temple, was, of course, way ahead of us because he talked about something I'd like to talk about now, which is originalism and textualism. And you write in the book, a judge should apply the Constitution or a congressional statute as it is, not as he thinks it should be. For me, respect for the separation of powers implies originalism and the application of the Constitution, and textualism in the interpretation of the statutes. So what do you mean by originalism and textualism?
Well, now we're getting pretty wonky, aren't we? But I'd be happy, I'd like to talk about this because I think there's some misconceptions. What is originalism? It's a terrible label. It makes you think of powdered wigs, 18th century old white men. That's not what it's about. It's not honoring just the original Constitution. It's honoring all of the Constitution, its amendments, and especially our second Constitution, the 13th, the 14th, the 15th Amendments, and of course the 19th Amendment. Originalism is simply the idea that judges shouldn't change anything in it, should try to honor the words as written and as they were understood when they were written. And that includes the 19th, that includes the 15th and the 14th Amendments. I consider Madison the father of the Constitution, and I have his portrait above one fireplace in my office, and above the other, I have John Marshall Harlan, the sole dissenter in Plessy versus Ferguson, because I consider him the father of the Reconstruction Amendments. The only one who got the Equal Protection Clause and its original meaning right. Because who can say segregation is consistent with the equal protection of the laws? Pretty brave for him to do that. Kentuckian. He looks pretty grumpy. He wasn't very popular, but he followed the original meaning of the Constitution, all of the Constitution. So what's the alternative? The alternative is something called, they like to call it the living Constitution. Much better label, much better labeling, much better marketing. Who wants a dead Constitution? I don't want a dead Constitution. I want an enduring, vital, and live Constitution too. A real one, where your rights matter. And here's what I worry about when judges depart from the original meaning and start evolving this Constitution on their own. Your rights can start disappearing. I'm not making this up. Let me give you an example. The Sixth Amendment to the Constitution. You law students, I hope you know what I'm talking about. You have a right to a trial by jury of your peers. You have a right to confront the accusers against you. Now, it doesn't take an academic to figure out what that means and what those original words meant when spoken and written. Yet, the Supreme Court of the United States and some living constitutionalist decisions have said that sometimes you don't have a right to a trial by jury because there are other things that are more important. The press of business, the difficulty of the matter. It's just not important enough. Yes, you're going to suffer maybe 10 more years in prison, but so what? They have. They balanced away your right. What about the right to confront your accusers? Living constitutionalism for a long time, until overruled recently in an originalist decision, said that you don't always have a right to confront your accusers. That sometimes a piece of paper written by a police officer out of court, long before the trial, you can hardly cross-examine that. Good luck. Good luck. I don't care how good you are, you law students out there. Tough to cross-examine a piece of paper. I've tried. That can be enough to send a person to prison for 20, 25 years or more. Originalism says no to that. It says, I might think that there are more important things, personally. I might think you're a really bad person and you should belong in jail forever. But it isn't up to me to decide what your rights should be. You wrote them down. We, the people, wrote those things down, and we, the people, deserve all of them. And not only does departing from the original meaning risk giving away rights, it also risks allowing judges to create rights that we never agreed to, we the people never agreed to. And there, my example for you is Dred Scott. That was the first decision by the United States Supreme Court in a serious matter that really radically departed from the original meaning of the Constitution. The Supreme Court of the United States held, as most of you law students know, I hope, that a white person has a right to own a black person in the territories of the United States, and that right emanates from the penumbra of the Fifth Amendment and its due process clause. And I'd ask you, scour the original meaning of due process. You're not going to find that there. Now, members of the court thought they were doing something good at the time. They really did. I think most of them thought they were well-intentioned and that they were doing something more important than following the original meaning. They were trying to avert an imminent civil war. But judges make rotten politicians, and they guessed wrong. And instead of averting a civil war, they contributed to it. So for me, originalism is all about respecting the rights that are there, that we, the people, agreed to. This is a republic, after all, and you own it. And not adding to it, because I don't think 9 people in Washington, however well-intentioned, should be making up or taking away your rights.
Let me challenge that respectfully. Sure. The Constitution was written by a number of white men 232 years ago, 1787. How do you accurately infer what they would think in a 21st century
It's hard. Doing law is hard, isn't it? Law students, you finding that hard? Yeah, it's hard. I'm not here to tell you it's easy, and I'm not here to tell you there's always a single right answer, all right? But it's what judges and lawyers have done for a millennium. That's what we do. I can find you 100 if I can find you one Supreme Court decision that says that judges should interpret statutes and contracts according to their original public meaning. And I'm unclear why we shouldn't do the same thing with the Constitution. Our founders rejected, they knew what an evolving living Constitution looked like. They came from England. They chose to write things down instead. They chose a different path deliberately. So Is originalism tough? Yes. Are we going to have disagreements? Yes. I'll give you an example. We had a double jeopardy case this last term. Can the states try you for the exact same crime that the federal government tried you for already? Well, we have a double jeopardy clause in the Constitution. And what did that originally mean? Did that prohibit two different sovereigns from trying you for the same crime? Justice Alito thought not, for the majority of the court. Justice Ginsburg and I, doing originalist work, thought it did, that the double jeopardy clause prohibits that. So there are going to be disagreements, but those are legal disagreements, not political disagreements. That's not Republican versus Democrat. That's not left versus right. That's what do these terms mean? And what have they historically meant? And Justice Ginsburg and I, in that case, saw it differently than the majority as to what it meant. I'll give you another example. Sessions versus DiMaia, maybe a year ago. What happens when a law is so vague nobody can understand it? Does the due process clause prohibit that? And how vague does it have to be? That's a tricky question, too, for an originalist. But there are precedents going all the way back. A lot of learning about that. That's a thing. Void for vagueness doctrine. At least some of us think it is, according to the original meaning of the Constitution. So there I participated in striking down a law. Justice Thomas, another originalist, thought this one passed muster. There are going to be disagreements. But let me tell you something that I like about originalist disagreements. We're disagreeing about that meaning. Living constitutionalist, we're disagreeing about how you want the country to change, what you want as an individual, as a person. And I don't think we were hired to run the country. I think we were hired to apply the law as neutrally and as fairly as we are able to do.
Justice, how do you respond to those who say that originalism is just a means to a conservative ruling?
Well, Sixth Amendment, did that sound conservative? Void for vagueness, striking down a law that prohibited an immigrant from entering the country, did that sound conservative? Did double jeopardy, did Ruth, in my opinion, sound conservative to you? It has no political valence whatsoever. That to me is a serious misunderstanding. And I'm hoping we're getting past that. There are plenty of progressive originalists in the academy and in the world today. And our founding fathers were very progressive in a lot of ways. The Fourth, Fifth, and Sixth Amendments, the 14th Amendment, those are progressive documents. And a faithful originalist will apply them all. You don't pick and choose. You do your best to apply them all fairly.
Let me get away from the wonky stuff for a second. We'll come back to it in a moment. But we'll go down that bumpy road I talked about. Talk about the confirmation process and what that was like for you.
Well, it's changed a bit, hasn't it, over the years? My predecessor, Antonin Scalia, smoked a pipe during his confirmation. My old boss, Byron White, I think his testimony lasted about 15 minutes. Actually, my hearing before the Senate Judiciary Committee, the first time for the 10th Circuit, lasted 15 minutes, if that. Things were a little different the second time around. I came out of that process a little concerned. I was honored, I was humbled. I was very impressed by the senators individually. And I admire the Senate as an institution greatly. And it's wonderful to be here in the home of the master of the United States Senate. But I also saw, I thought, some misunderstandings about judges, as we were kind of discussing. I would go in, some folks would say, you really should be very firm in respecting precedent. Always follow precedent. But I got these three over here you really got to overrule. Right? And then over here, I meet with this fellow, and he'd say, you got to respect precedent. But those three over there, you got to overrule. We all have our favorites and our least favorites, right? And I came to realize that, it's one thing to think that judges will sometimes follow their personal preferences because we're human and we make mistakes and we err and we don't always live up to our aspirations. And it's another thing to think that judges should do whatever they want or follow a political agenda. And the judges are really just sort of politicians in robes. So that got me a little concerned that maybe we're losing something. And then I dug further into it, and this really was the impulse for the book. And we do have a problem. Only about a third of Americans can name the 3 branches of government, I learned. A third can name 1. 75% can name the 3 Stooges, which is pretty remarkable when you think about it, right? It's been a while. And 10% think that Judith Sheindlin serves on the United States Supreme Court. Now, those who are chuckling know who I'm talking about. That's Judge Judy. I like Judge Judy. She is not one of my colleagues. So, I am a little concerned about civics, civic education and understanding. I'm also concerned about civility and how we treat one another when we disagree. I'm really concerned about young people getting involved in public service and not being scared away by it. So those are the reasons why I sat down and wrote the book. And that's what I got out of the confirmation process, was this project.
Let me go back to civics. The importance of teaching civics. Here's what you write in the introduction, Justice. You write, to succeed where so many others have failed, the framers of our Constitution understood that our republic needs citizens who know how their government works and who are capable of and interested in participating in its administration. Why are we seeing civics, no interest in civics in this country? What has happened? Where at one point, I think we knew a lot about the way our government works. We understood the checks and balances. We understood the different branches. What has happened such that we no longer appreciate those things?
It is interesting, isn't it? I don't know all of it, but we've had to make room for STEM and other things like that in our curriculum. Good things. President Johnson could tell us better. He was the teacher, wasn't he? But I am concerned, and I'm really concerned that young people are losing their appetite for public service. We need you. A republic is very special, right? And especially ours. It's already the longest lived written national constitution in history. Republics don't last very long in history, if you go through the history books. It's easy enough to run an oligarchy or a monarchy, right? You only need a few people who are trained in how to run the place. A republic, we need a lot of people. And it's the marketplace of ideas that makes us strong. And our country doesn't have the benefit that some countries claim to have. A lot of countries are basically made up of people of one culture with shared ancient history. We're bound together by an idea. The idea that you have unalienable rights that come before government, that we are all equal, and that the people can govern themselves and do so wisely together with mutual respect, and to listen as well as talk, and to tolerate as well as demand tolerance. And that doesn't happen by itself or overnight or easily. I worry when I read that today only about 30% of millennials think it's important to live in a democracy. That has dropped precipitously over recent years. I worry when 60% or more of young people say they're not interested in going into public service because of the nature of our dialogue. I worry when 60% of Americans would fail the citizenship test that my wife had to take and passed. So those things concern me. I don't have all the cures. I don't pretend to. I would just say that for whatever our difficulties, and we have plenty of them, but we've always had plenty of them. Republics do. They're raucous places. That we sometimes need to remember, I think, what Webster told us, Daniel Webster, right? Miracles don't happen in clusters. And what happened here took 6,000 years to happen. And we shouldn't expect that it'll happen all that often. Take care with this republic, please. It's a very special thing you've been given. Young people tell me they're citizens of the world sometimes. I hear that. I don't know what that means. Now, if you're telling me that I respect the dignity and worth of each person, and I recognize that I am no better than any person on this planet, that we are all the same, I am with you 100%. But if you're telling me that the inheritance we have here in this country, that our Constitution isn't something special, the opportunity to govern ourselves is just a thing, I'd ask you to think again.
So I appreciate you mentioned you don't have all the answers. But can you think of anything that could help to remedy this problem?
Well, get involved. Let me tell you, some of you may know the story of Gregory Watson. He's one of yours, University of Texas. I think a lot of people think they can't change things, they can't make a difference. Gregory Watson was asked to write a paper on some aspect of constitutional law. Here at the University of Texas, I believe, right? Mm-hmm. And he wrote, and he said, Madison, when he was writing the Bill of Rights, had a couple extras that were lying around that never got fully ratified by the people. And one of them, it had to do with the pay of Congress. And said that congressmen's pay couldn't be increased until after the election, another intervening election, so that the American people could have their say about that pay rise. It was pretty close to ratification, but it had never been fully ratified. And he said, I bet you, if we just got a few more states to do it, we could get this thing passed. His teacher thought that was a crazy, crazy idea. Gave him a C. That may be the most consequential C one of you professors has ever written. Because Gregory Watson he was annoyed by that, and he was motivated by it. And he got involved, and he started just writing state legislators around the country on his personal campaign. Can you imagine? And he made himself such a pain. The state legislators started taking it up. And one after another started adopting it. It is now the 27th Amendment to the United States Constitution, ratified in 1992, I believe, by a University of Texas student. And recently, his professor changed the grade to an A.
You mentioned LBJ as the master of the Senate. I think one of the reasons that he was a master, one of the many reasons, is he adhered to his favorite biblical proverb, which was from the book of Isaiah, "Come, let us reason together." And there isn't a great deal of togetherness in America, as you alluded to earlier, Justice, the decline of civility in our country. And you cite a statistic, you write that 75% of Americans believe that our country is suffering from a crisis of civility. Why are we seeing such deep divisions in our country today?
Well, let me pull back the curtain on the Supreme Court a little bit, just to give you a flavor of how life really is on my court and the courts across the country, because I actually think, I don't have all the answers, but I do know people who do it well and who do reason together. And I'm very lucky to have them as colleagues. Do we disagree? You betcha. Of course you. You give us the 70 hardest cases in the entire United States of America to decide every year. Thanks a lot. Of course there are. Of course there's going to be disagreement. But there's also a tremendous reservoir of mutual respect, admiration, and yes, even love. And we have fun together. Every time we meet, we shake each other's hands, no matter what's going on, no matter how hard the moment. And that's a tradition that's gone on for 150 years, maybe. We eat lunch together a lot. Every day there's argument or conference, and that's most days from October to May. Now, not everybody's there every day, and we certainly don't talk shop. But Justice Breyer brings a lot of knock-knock jokes from his grandchildren. And it is the government, so it's bring your own lunch. So it's true. It's true. And the Supreme Court's a small place. There are only a few hundred people who work there. It's like any small shop. You know one another. We flip hamburgers at the employee cookout. Kids, we bring our kids, the employees bring their kids to trick or treat through our chambers at Halloween. Christmas, we sing songs together. We sing each other happy birthday very badly, but enthusiastically. And we play practical jokes. Here's one. So I'm a Rockies fan. Got a lot of baseball fans on the court. Sonia Sotomayor is a huge Yankees fan. Nobody's quite perfect. And I think it was last year. They were doing really well, the Yankees. And when we come in, we shake each other's hands, we put on our robes, and we line up to go into the courtroom. It's just like grade school, right? You line up. First the buzzer goes 5 minutes beforehand. And then you come in, you got to put on your uniform and line up. And we're coming in, we're lining up, and Sonia's wearing a robe with pinstripes on it. And the New York Yankees logo. And we're getting ready to go in the courtroom. And I think some of my colleagues are wondering, really? And finally one of them says, Sonia, are you really going to wear that in the court? And she responded, no, I was just waiting for one of you to ask. So, that's how we treat one another at the Supreme Court. And I do think no one, we all live in glass houses on this one, don't we? None of us is perfect. And no one should be in the business of throwing stones. But I do wonder if we sometimes, and our republic is supposed to be a little raucous. It is. And an elbow will be thrown on the field of play from time to time. And we're not doing all that bad compared to maybe some points in our history. I mean, you all now know Hamilton's story. We're not shooting. The Vice President of the United States and the Secretary of Treasury are not engaged in dueling. That's good. Senators aren't caning one another on the floor. I learned the other day at the National Archives. I think it was there. I did not know this. The members of Congress at that point in time used to run bragging about their right hook and how that would be an advantage on the floor. So, but can we do a better job? Yeah. Do we need to? Yeah. I think we sometimes need to remember that the people with whom we disagree love this country every bit as much as we do. And, we used to teach, I don't know when civility became a bad word. I don't know when we stopped teaching that along with civics. We used to teach these things. George Washington, as a young man, and I think this contributed to his success, he always practiced great civility. He was respected by one another. And as a young man, he had to write out the 110 rules of civility and decent behavior. It was a book written by the Jesuits in 1595. Now, there are some great rules in there, and there are some silly ones, too. My favorite I don't know the number, but it's something like, when you disagree with your opponent, do not approach him so closely or speak so vehemently that you bedew the other man's face with your spittle. My teenagers would say it, don't spray it. Now, I'm not sure we need to go back to 1595, but it's a pretty simple rule. We all know it, and we've all been taught it many times in many different ways. The golden rule, right? And isn't civility just an outward sign that we accept the equality of the other person? That the other person is our equal and deserves the same treatment we'd want for ourselves? For me, it's a rule that was best expressed by my wife's grandmother, who had lived a life full of ups and downs. And the way she put it to me is, Neil, you're going to have a lot of regrets in life. I hate to break it to you. Just the nature of life. There are going to be things you do or say that you wish you hadn't. And there are going to be things that you left undone and unsaid that you deeply regret. But the one thing you'll never regret is being kind.
There is a wonderful story in your book. Actually, let me take it back. I'll get to that in 1 second. While you've taken us behind the curtain of the Supreme Court, take us into that legendary conference room where you talk about the cases that are before the court at any given time and how you express your different points of view. What does debate look like among you 9 members of the Supreme Court in that conference room?
I sometimes say I really wish the American people could see that, because they would be so proud of what happens there, I think. On the other hand, I'm really glad you can't. Because it's a place where people can talk candidly and change their minds, right? We're still in the process of making up our minds. It's a small table. It's actually more cramped than I thought it was. So we're right next to each other. And the junior justice has to answer the door. That's one of his or her tasks. If there's a knock at the door, and there very frequently is. Somebody's usually forgotten their reading glasses. So we go around the table by seniority. So the Chief Justice starts the discussion, and then it will go to the most senior Associate Justice. And it works its way around the table till everybody has said their piece. And by the time it gets to me as a junior justice, one of 2 things has happened. 1, nobody really cares what I have to say. The outcome is obvious. Or everybody's hinging, waiting on every word, right? But the truth is, there's usually, after that first round, a second round, and more of an open discussion. But everybody gets to be heard first. We listen as well as talk. We tolerate as well as expect tolerance. It works. It works exactly the way it's supposed to work, I think.
And I take it there's no spittle. Is that there is a wonderful, you mentioned a family member, there was a wonderful story, going back to your confirmation, when you were in the White House and you were talking to your father-in-law on the phone about the imminent announcement that you were President Trump's choice for the Supreme Court. Can you relate that story?
Sure. So not only did we have to sneak out of Boulder, we had to sneak into Washington. I'm not sure which was trickier. They brought us through the kitchen of the White House. And that was really a treat. I hadn't been in the kitchen. I'm sure you gentlemen have. And it's quite a privilege because you can actually see the scars of the War of 1812 there. There are burn marks still in the marble. There are chips where bullets had hit the White House. We're taken upstairs to the residence. The president was gracious enough to allow me to use the Lincoln bedroom as my office for the day. I wrote my remarks for the East Room later that evening at a desk on which sits the Gettysburg Address. Wow. And the president knew that Louise is from England, so he allowed her to use as her office for the day the Queen's bedroom across the hall. How cool is that? Now, we weren't allowed many phone calls, but Louise was allowed to call her dad back in England. I think they figured, what the heck, who's he gonna tell? And so she called him, not me, she called him, and she said, Dad, you're never gonna guess. Neil is about to be nominated to the Supreme Court of the United States. And he said, honey, I've stayed up late. It's late, and, you know, how many hours I had? I stayed up late. I'm watching your American news, and I'm sorry. There's this other guy. And he said, they got him at a gas station on CNN. And he's driving to Washington. That's a friend of mine. And they did have cameras on everybody. And you know, Louise says, well, Dad, we're in the Lincoln bedroom. Pretty sure it's gonna be Neil. Father-in-law. Honey, it's President Trump. The other guy might be down the hall. In-laws, right?
There's a chapter in the book titled...
Some things don't change.
There's a chapter in the book titled Toward Justice for All that deals with the challenges that we currently face on access to justice. You are deeply concerned about that. Talk about your concerns and talk about how we might remedy that challenge that we face in our country today.
Yeah, so I am an optimist about America, but I think we also ought to be, as a lawyer, as a judge, clear-eyed about some of our problems in our own house. And I think access to justice on the civil side and overcriminalization on the criminal law side are things we need to talk about. And I think it's a problem when, as a lawyer, I could not afford my own legal services. And I really can't now. It takes way too long to get to trial. When you get there, you don't get a jury. Young people are walking out of law school with hundreds of thousands of dollars in debt. Even if they want to serve Main Street clients, they can't afford to do so. We have rules that prohibit non-lawyers from providing even basic services. Wills, uncontested divorces. We prevent non-lawyers from even investing in the legal profession. I can go to Walmart or a superstore and get all kinds of sophisticated services. I can't get somebody to help me with a basic contract. Other countries, England allows you to become a lawyer after 3 years of undergraduate study or a 1-year conversion course. Why do we require 7 years university to do anything in the law? These are some questions I have. On the criminal law side, I wonder, is it just about everything a federal crime? I asked my law clerks not long ago, how many federal crimes are there? I mean, there seemed to, not a lot. And they came back quickly and said, 4,500. I said, well, that's not, it's a big country. Maybe that's not too bad. Now, remember, most crimes are punished by the states, not the federal government. I said, okay, but these days now, Congress has allowed bureaucracies to write additional rules that have criminal sanctions. So they're really new federal criminal laws as well. Did you catch those? And they said, no. This is just the statutes, not the delegated stuff of the agencies. I said, well, those, you can go to prison for 20 years for those things too. So I want to know about those. How many of those are there? And they came back to me, but it took them a long time. They came back to me finally and said, boss, we don't know. How could you not know? Right? That's a thing in the world. It should be, and they said, well, they used to count, but stopped about 20 years ago. And they stopped counting because there were so many, there were over 300,000 at that point. So if you sell a mattress never pull off that tag. Remember Woodsy the owl? Give a hoot, don't pollute. Do not misuse his likeness. And if you sell ketchup, you better become familiar with something called the Bostwick consistometer. Because if your ketchup runs through it too quickly, it's too runny, and you don't label it substandard ketchup, you're in big trouble. I have law professor friends who tell me they think that just about everyone over 18 years old in this country is a federal criminal. And it's funny, but it also allows prosecutors to choose who to prosecute rather than pursuing crime that's obvious and before them. So there's reason to talk about these things.
You write in the book about the importance of juries. Why are juries important? If you have a learned, wise judge presiding over a case, why do you need a jury?
John Adams said that the right to vote and the right to serve on a jury are the heart and lungs of democracy. And it's actually part of the separation of powers and the design of our Constitution. That it's we the people who are in charge. We often forget that, don't we? Doesn't seem that way sometimes. But your right to vote is your way to stay in charge of the legislative and executive branches. Indirectly, at times, but that's how we keep control, we the people. And to serve on a jury, the founders thought, is how you keep control of judges too. I think juries are very important. Maybe because I used to be a trial lawyer. I love juries. There's wisdom in juries. They see things that a judge can't see. 12 sets of eyes, always better than one, aren't they? Big believer in juries.
Should we challenge the notion that judgments by a jury should be unanimous?
Well, I'm not going to talk about anything that might come before the court, and that issue is coming before the court.
Fair enough.
So I won't talk about that. I do want to say, though, on the rule of law, I've sounded depressing, haven't I? A little depressing. But really, I think, I'm an optimist, I can't help it, but I don't think I'm Pollyannish. Let me tell you why. There are, for all our troubles in our court systems, and there are real ones, there are 50 million lawsuits filed every year in this country. You are a litigious bunch. And I'm not counting your traffic tickets, and I'm not counting your parking tickets. That is another 50 million. Wow, right? Now, the figures I'm going to give you are from the federal system, but the ones from the state system are probably even better, but I know the federal system by heart. Out of those that wind up in court, the 50 million I'm going to talk about, 95% are resolved by the trial judge or jury without an appeal. Now, I was a lawyer for a long time, and I had plenty of losing clients. And any lawyer who says he didn't is lying to you or hasn't been practicing very long. And my clients would often say, I think the judge is dead wrong. The jury got it wrong. But I was heard. I got to say my piece. The judgment's reasonably fair. They may not say it, but they think it. And they don't appeal. 95% are resolved without further appeal. Okay, what about the 5% that go to appeal? My old Court of Appeals, the 10th Circuit, 6 states, 2 time zones, 20% of the continental United States. We sit in panels of 3. I sat with judges appointed by President Obama all the way back to President Lyndon Baines Johnson. One of my favorite and dearest colleagues, Bill Holloway, there's a tribute to him in the book, was appointed by President Johnson in 1968, the year after I was born. He was my colleague. I loved him. We sit in panels of 3. We're only hearing the hard cases where people have bothered to appeal. We managed to reach unanimous agreement 95% of the time. Okay, I think we're doing pretty well in the rule of law in this country. I think it's actually a miracle. It's one of the wonders of the world, and it's one of the envies of the world. Now, the cynic among us says, and we all have some of it in us, well, what about those cases that go to the Supreme Court? Say, fine. I've given you the forest, now we can talk about the tree. We decide 70 cases a year at the United States Supreme Court, as I discussed, the hardest ones in the country, the ones where the lower courts have disagreed vehemently. We don't take it unless there's really serious disagreement. My law clerks will tell me it's not worth dealing with a circuit split that's immature because it needs to percolate. Now, I don't know how a circuit split percolates. Coffee used to. It doesn't even percolate anymore, right? And I don't know how you mix your metaphor between percolation and maturity, but there we are. That's what I get told. So we wait for really serious endemic disagreements among the lower courts. So we get the best thinking from both sides. That's why we do it, right? So we don't make a mistake when we take it. We try to minimize taking things that haven't really matured. People haven't had a chance to think through. Now, I have colleagues back in Colorado, and you have them here in Texas, who decide 70 cases before lunch. There are only 70 of those kinds of cases in the entire country every year. The rule of law in this country is magical. So those 70 cases, you say, what about those? There are 9 of us now, no longer 3. We're appointed from across the entire country, not just a region. Though there are an awful lot of New Yorkers on the United States Supreme Court, aren't there? And it's been a while since you've had a Texan. Be that as it may, 9 of us, appointed by 5 different presidents over a quarter of a century. Try and get 9 people to agree on where to go to lunch. We agree on the hardest cases in the country 40% of the time. What about those 5-4s? Okay, let's deal with those. That's about 25 to 33% of our docket. And last year there were 10 different combinations of justices in those 5-4 decisions. I'm told Justice Kavanaugh and I disagreed 30% of the time. Those are the facts. Now, I'm not sure how often you hear them, right? We live in a world where there's a lot of clickbait, a lot of reasons to want to disagree. But those are the facts. And here's my favorite one. That 40% figure of unanimity and the 5-4s occupying 25 to 33% of our docket, those numbers basically haven't changed since 1945. The only thing that's new is that nothing is new. And wait, there's more. Back then in 1945, Franklin Delano Roosevelt had appointed 8 of the 9 justices on the United States Supreme Court. And if we're doing as well as 8 of them appointed by a single president, I think we're doing okay.
Well, I'm sure, Justice, you're mindful of your one of your mentors, Byron White's admonition that we will all be forgotten soon. When you end your Supreme Court tenure, what do you want history to say about it? What will your legacy be?
First off, I hope I've taught a few people to aim high along the way. I'm so proud of my law clerks. I've got one of them in the audience tonight, Toby Young. She's a Texan here, actually. First enrolled tribal member to serve as a law clerk on the United States Supreme Court. My 2 co-authors who wrote the book with me, Janie Nitsa, her family escaped communism, Czechoslovakia. Dave Feder, his family, half of them are Mexican immigrants, the other half are Holocaust survivors. I see so many young people who love this country and are ready to step forward. I hope they're a bit of my legacy. I hope I'm remembered as a loving husband and father. And after that, I'm happy to be forgotten along with Byron White and the rest of them.
Very well done. You have imparted several pieces of advice about mentors and a few other things tonight, but we have an audience that's comprised of students, largely of students, many law school students, and many students who are contemplating a career in law. What advice would you give to those folks?
Well, I've got a whole chapter on that.
Yes.
And that really comes from, a friend of mine was dean of the University of Law School, and he asked me to teach ethics. And when I first approached me, I said, gosh, that course? I thought that was supposed to be taught by some old battle-worn practitioner with gray hair who'd tell scary stories to scare the kids straight. And then he said, have you looked in the mirror lately? We don't have time for everything I'd love to say to the young people here. But the one thing I guess I'd ask them to remember is remember why you went to law school. At the end of the semester, I'd always ask my kids to do the following corny exercise. Spend 5-10 minutes in class writing your obituary. Now, there'd be a snicker or two whenever I started this thing. But after 5 or 10 minutes, the room was always deathly quiet. And then I'd ask them, a few brave souls, to read out what they'd written. And you know what they never wrote? They never wrote how rich they'd become. And they certainly never wrote that they were proud that they'd be rainmakers at their law firms, or that they billed the most hours, or they brought in the most clients, or they had the biggest house, or the fanciest car. They all wrote about their families, being good in their families, being good to their friends, and leaving the world maybe a little better or no worse off than they found it. And I'd say to the kids, do me one favor. It's the only thing I'm ever going to ask of you. Hold on to that piece of paper. Stick it in your desk drawer at your office. And when you're feeling low, or maybe a little cynical, pull that out and ask yourself how you're doing on the metrics that really matter.
Mr. Justice, we thank you for your presence here tonight. We thank you for your wise words, and most important, we thank you for your service to our nation. Thank you very much. Thank you. Enjoyed the conversation.